Today, I would like to talk about experimental mark making. Okay, and I'd like to start with an artist named Cy Twombly. Now, Cy Twombly was born in 1928 in Lexington, Virginia. He studied art at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston before moving to New York to attend the Art Students League. Now, it was there, at the Art Students League in New York City, that he met Robert Rauschenberg, who encouraged him to attend Black Mountain College in 1951. Now, among his teachers at Black Mountain were Robert Motherwell and Franz Kline. Okay, now this is an early Cy Twombly painting from that period, from 1951. It's untitled, but it's apparently called Lexington, referring to where he was born in 1928. He was born in Lexington, Virginia. I understand that it can be difficult to make sense of this painting about what he was up to. Keeping in mind he was young at the time. He was 20 years old. 23 years old. But it just seems to be an arrangement, a simple arrangement of marks in various tones of black and gray and white on a beige background. I suppose we could think of it as being expressive. Certainly, if we think of it that way, it makes sense because of who his teachers were. Let's take a look at his teachers. This is Robert Motherwell. Now, we did talk about Motherwell in the last presentation. I presented Robert Motherwell as an example of an artist, a rare example of an artist who wrote very well about painting. And his writing was influential, but really useful to his peers. He was one of the youngest and the most literary figures in the abstract expressionist movement, and he's often thought of as a figure who bridged the European modernists with the New York School of Painting in America, or the abstract expressionists. By the European modernists, we are talking primarily about the surrealists. And he essentially translated the ideas of the surrealists for an American audience. Okay, he embraced key ideas from the surrealist movement, including automatism, meaning that imagery should be spontaneous and not premeditated. And this painting is called Elegy to the Spanish Republic. It's from 1958, but he made a large number of these. I think he began painting these Elegy to the Spanish Republics, all based on these same forms. The circles kind of squished between these upright vertical shapes. He made them for about 10 years, I think, 1951 to 1962, something like that. It's Robert Motherwell, and this is Franz Kline. And this is called Mahoning, 1956. Again, very simple paintings. This is characteristic of the paintings he was doing all throughout the 1950s. And they're simple. They look. It's easy to just think of them as black marks on a blank background. Franz Kline's violently powerful black and white paintings are essentially studies in the relationship between negative and positive space. So he famously said, "I paint the white as well as the black, and the white is just as important." So when you hear that, they become less like black marks on a white background. He would paint the black brushstrokes and the white canvas ground in alternating order, considering each of them equally. Now, the remarkable thing about these paintings, when you encounter them in real life, it does become clear. It's palpable. There's a palpable sense that the viewer gets that each of these elements, the black areas and the white areas, is essential to the other's existence. Okay, it's a yin-yang kind of a relationship. Without one, the other could not exist. Now, talking about experimental mark making, let's go back and look at Willem de Kooning and the work that he was doing in the 1950s. And I believe he was there as well at Black Mountain College when Cy Twombly was there. Now, if we look again at the paintings that Willem de Kooning was making at this time, it's understood that his gestural experimental mark making was expressive. Right? We can read the aggressive gestural marks that he used in these women paintings as being representative of his state of mind. In fact, he was accused of because of the violence of these paintings, he was accused of misogyny, okay, of harboring negative feelings towards women. People thought that's what these paintings meant. He said they were joyful, you'll remember. So he contradicted that suggestion. But the indication there is that these paintings were also generating feelings in the viewers, right? So we can understand how these expressive marks can generate feelings in the viewer as well. They're representative of the feelings of the artist, and they're capable of generating feelings in the viewer. But then there's this. This is Cy Twombly's Academy from 1955. At this point, he's in New York, and he's associating with Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. Now, this seems to be something different, something a bit more challenging. Okay, now the title Academy suggests that this painting is a response to the work of his teachers, who were not long ago thought of themselves as radical upstarts, but they're now widely regarded by 1955 as accomplished artists. Abstract Expressionism has matured, and these artists were accepted as masters and teachers. This painting is made up of scribbles in crayon and pencil, as though he's renouncing de Kooning's luscious oil paint, Rothko's carefully constructed color fields, even Jackson Pollock's richly complex, delicately poured ribbons of enamel paint. I'm going to show you a detail of this. Here's what it looks like close up. If you go back, you can see there are whole words here. Some of them bad words. What he did was he covered the surface of the painting with a thin coat of house paint. So again, an oil-based enamel from 1950s. And then he scrawled and he scribbled all over the painting with fragments of nearly illegible writing and drawing that more closely resembles the kind of graffiti that one might encounter on a bathroom wall than the elegant automatic or automatistic drawing exercises of the surrealists. He then applies subsequent layers, thin layers of house paint, and he repeats the exercise again and again until the work becomes dense and complex. Now it's also untitled. It's from 1967. So this is, 13 years later? 12 years later. And his work is evolving. It's evolved away from something that resembles urban graffiti towards a kind of repetitive calligraphic gestural drawing that recalls chalk on a chalkboard with no form and no actual words. Now, to make these paintings, he sat on a friend's shoulders as the friend shuffled back and forth across the width of the canvas, allowing the artist to concentrate fully on the creation of fluid, natural lines. I'll show you a detail of this one as well. Now, in this case as well, the fact that he went over the canvas again and again, incorporating tonal shifts and a heavily worked surface, it gives these works a density and a complexity that's undeniably compelling. They have a graceful, natural quality. And along with Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, he is regarded as one of the most important figures of the generation of artists who challenged abstract expressionism. And by the 1970s, he began to invoke landscape to some extent in his use of color, as well as more legible passages of writing and collaged elements. Now, these paintings are, again, undeniably powerful. You feel something when you're in the presence of them. But why? Couldn't they just be described as just scribbles? The dismissive phrase, "my kid could have painted that." Well, it certainly applies to this work, if it applies to anything. And I don't think it's fair to dismiss the Cy Twombly paintings in that way. As I said before, they are when you're in the presence of them, they are undeniably powerful things. And Twombly, he was influential. He lived a long life, and his work slowly progressed, and he was active in the studio, and he was still exhibiting his work until he passed away in 2011. Okay, He's credited as a major influence for a generation of artists who, in the 1980s, rejected the minimalism and the conceptualism of the 1970s. You can you can see a pattern forming here. This does happen again and again. A generation of young artists comes up, and their program involves presenting an alternative to the work of their predecessors. Okay, so these artists instead embraced a new approach to expressionism. Again, as an alternative to minimalism and conceptualism. Okay, this approach to expressionism was one that reintroduced the figure and narrative. Now, these were the neo-expressionists of the 1980s. These were artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat, Francesco Clemente, George Basslets, Julian Schnabel, and Anselm Kiefer. Now, this is a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting. It's called Fallen Angel from 1981. Basquiat, I think he was born in Brooklyn, grew up in New York, and he had kind of a rough childhood, I think, and drug problems. I believe he was homeless. And he was a graffiti artist before he became a famous painter. And this is Francesco Clemente, an Italian artist. This is called Conversion to Her. This is from 1986. Clemente's interesting. He's still active. I believe he still is working in New York City, but he always maintained a studio in New York and in India. And I always found it very interesting how different the paintings were that he made in his New York studio as opposed to the ones he made in his studio in India. They were very different. This is George Basslets. This is the Bruck Chorus or De Brucke Chor from 1983. You can always recognize a Basslets painting. The figures are always upside down. It's a bit of a shtick, but it is what it is. This is Julian Schnabel. This is The Death of Fashion from 1978. This is from the 70s, but he continued to make these paintings using a thick gestural painting combined with broken crockery, mostly plates, broken plates embedded in the surface of the paintings. All through the 80s, he made paintings that looked like this. And this is Anselm Kiefer. This is Lilith, 1987 to 89. You can see in this painting this kind of graffiti-like scribbled words in here. We looked at Kiefer. I told you the story in an earlier presentation of how when Anselm Kiefer had an exhibition at the gallery, they had to sweep up the floors every night because there was so much junk falling off of Kiefer's paintings. So there's a whole generation of artists who report that they've been moved by these Cy Twombly paintings. They all cite Cy Twombly as a major influence on their work, and in all of them you can see in different ways and to varying degrees the influence of Cy Twombly's painting in their paintings. And it would be easy just to say, well, they're interested in expressionism and the Cy Twombly paintings because they're just made out from these gestural marks. They're expressionists, so they naturally would have an affinity for these paintings. But I believe there's something else going on. I think that when we look at painting like this, I think there's something else happening, something that's not just about communicating emotion. And that something is called proprioception. Now, this is a later Cy Twombly painting, untitled. This is Bacchus. I think there was a series of Bacchus paintings from the early 2000s, 2003, 2008. So proprioception, as human beings, we're social, we're cultural, but much of what goes on inside of us, much of how we function in and experience the world, has to do with our autonomic nervous system. We have a system that keeps us breathing, that keeps our hearts beating, and we have these receptors, proprioceptors and interoceptors in our joints and in our tissues that provide our brains with information about our movements and about our body's position in space without us having to consider these things consciously. This is called proprioception. Now, if you've studied dance or martial arts, you may be familiar with proprioception. But regardless, in the 1800s, they called it muscle sense. Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist, he calls it our secret or our subconscious sense. There's a story in one of his books about a man, a construction worker, who suffers brain damage, which affects only his proprioceptive functions. I think he got a piece of rebar right through his head. It knocked out his proprioceptive functions. His cognitive abilities, those were entirely intact. But he bumps into things and he has no idea what his arms or his legs are doing unless he can see them. Now, he deals with this by fabricating a hat with a level in it. The level with a little bubble, right? Like a carpenter's level. So he can at least manage to stay upright and not fall over. He just has to keep the bubble in the middle. Now, when we talk about, I don't know, I want to put forward the idea that proprioception is an aesthetic sense. The idea here is that it's possible to make aesthetic judgments based on proprioceptive experience. Now, when we talk about paintings being fluid or natural or graceful or about mark making being intuitive, I think that this is to an extent what we're talking about the fact that we make paintings with our bodies and that there's a kinesthetic element to the activity that's either only partially conscious or entirely unconscious. And when we experience a painting or when we receive a painting, we do so both visually and with a complex understanding of how the body works. Mark Rothko, for instance, he spoke of an ideal relationship, and he meant a physical one between the observer, the viewer, and the painting. He hung the paintings low. This was the way that he painted them in the studio. And he referred to them as having human scale. And I think that's related here to what I'm talking about. There have been scientific studies. There's backup for this. There have been scientific studies that explore the functions of mirror neurons. These are neurons in our brain that are activated in the brains of both those who perform a task as well as in those who see the task performed. Okay. The idea is that painting can be received not just visually by the viewer, that it can be received not just visually, but kinesthetically or somatically. Okay, that painting can be thought of as a record not only of an activity. Remember Rosenberg, the art critic in the early 1950s, talking about the painting, the canvas as an arena in which to act when he defined action painting. The idea here is that painting can be thought of not only as a record of an activity, but also as a record of the movement and the position of the body in space. Okay, and I'm suggesting here that a good viewer receives a painting not only by looking, but also through a complex understanding of the limitations and the potentials of the human body. And when I say a good viewer, I think that looking at paintings is something that you learn to do. And as you do it more, you become better at it. And we've been talking a lot in these presentations about what painting is good for, how painting operates, how meaning is created, the function of painting. The idea is that painting is useful because of how it connects us to our physicality, okay, especially around proprioception, how it connects us to our physicality and to the physical nature of the world. The most common criticism of painting has to do with the archaic quality of it, how it has nothing to do with how we live in the world today. It's made by hand. There's this precious original, and we live in a technologically dependent world. So how could painting matter? Well, I think the physicality of painting and this proprioception It could be the very thing about painting that makes it valuable in today's technologically dependent world. Now, this idea is also supported by not just the mirror neuron studies, but other studies that say that when we witness the movements of others, we often have an unconscious kinesthetic response to those movements in ourselves. These kinesthetic responses are proprioceptive responses. Now, it's easy to see how this relates to our responses to and our appreciation of dance, for instance. And I mentioned martial arts earlier, kind of the same thing, or sports in general, anything that has to do with the movement of human beings, right? But dance is an art form that's entirely dependent on the movement of human beings. But I think this also explains how we can have a powerful aesthetic response to gestural painting like this. Okay, and this is two of these big ones. I think that's Bacchus and another one. Maybe they're both Bacchus paintings at the Gauguin Gallery in London in 2015. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That one was fun for me. I know, yeah, paintings like this can be difficult to appreciate. And I've found it useful myself to if I struggle with appreciating or understanding something, to try to look deeper at the reasons what I may be missing, right? Like, is there something going on here that's significant, that I don't understand, that I could learn about? And I know that diving into the idea of how proprioception, understanding this particular aspect of our autonomic nervous system, something subconscious or very unconscious about the way that we experience the world in our everyday life, how understanding this can help to make sense of entire movements in painting, or certainly make sense of the significance of experimental mark making. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.